in the iron-cold January of 1883 in the Dakota Territory, while other homesteaders were busy killing frostbitten hens and packing up empty nest boxes, Dorothy Hargrave was doing something else entirely. She was taking apart her late husband's 3 woolen army coats, still carrying his smell and the faint stain of his blood, and layering them into the walls of the chicken coop. Neighbors called it wasteful, even disgraceful. But when the blizzard hit and the mercury hardened at 40 below, Dorothy's coop stayed warm while others froze solid. What she discovered inside that insulated shack would change her fortune forever. Dorothy Hargrave was a 29-year-old widow on the unforgiving Dakota plains, left with a half-built homestead, a handful of scrawny hens, and almost no money. In that brutal winter, a family's survival often depended on fresh eggs, yet the cold killed brood after brood. Her neighbors saved every scrap of wool for hats and mittens, so when they saw her cutting apart a soldier's dress uniform to insulate a chicken coop, they didn't just whisper about waste, they called it a desecration. But Dorothy believed something they didn't. That warmth wasn't just about survival, it was about output. Could a grieving woman's stubborn gamble on her husband's coats force nature to bend? The answer would soon make her the most hated and the most prosperous woman in the entire county. It began with a death, not the quiet, expected kind that came from old age or slow illness, but the sudden kind that leaves a person standing alone in a half-built world, clutching the tools of a life that no longer existed. In August of 1882, Thomas Hargrave had ridden out to repair a stretch of fence along the creek. His horse came back without him. They found him in the shallow water, neck broken, his felted army coat soaked through. He was 31 years old. Dorothy buried him on a rise overlooking the homestead they'd carved from the Dakota prairie, and she did not cry in front of the neighbors. That night, she hung his 3 woolen coats on the peg by the door, still carrying the smell of lanolin, sweat, and the faint copper of blood that refused to wash out. She left them there. To anyone who visited, those coats were a shrine, the last untouched traces of a dead husband. But to Dorothy, they were something else, a question she hadn't yet learned to ask. That first winter alone nearly killed her. The months that followed Thomas's death were a blur of wind and hunger, and by the time the snows arrived in November of '82, Dorothy was already surviving on the thinnest margin. She had 6 hens, barred rocks, good layers in warm weather but utterly helpless when temperatures fell. She'd stuffed straw into the cracks of the chicken coop and banked snow against its outer walls, but none of it was enough. One by one, the birds stopped laying. Then they began to die. By New Year's morning of 1883, she woke to a coop full of frost-covered feathers and stiff little bodies. The last hen was alive but barely, huddled in the corner with its comb blackened by frostbite. Dorothy's hands trembled as she lifted the bird and tucked it into a basket by the stove. It would never lay again. The eggs that might have kept her through the hardest weeks were gone, and so was her only source of currency. But here's the part that few homesteaders ever understood. Dorothy Hargrave was not just a grieving widow. She was a woman who had learned to read the rules of the land, not with books, but with her own bone-deep exhaustion. She'd watched her mother starve in Ohio and had come west with Thomas because he believed the Dakota Territory was a chance to build something that no one could take from them. She knew that survival wasn't about sentiment, it was about sacrifice. And in the second week of January, as she stared at that empty coop with the bitter wind clawing through the chinking, her eyes drifted back toward the peg by the door. Those 3 army coats. Heavy, double-layered wool, woven so tight you could hold them up to a candle and see no light through the threads. Thomas had worn them through the Shenandoah Valley in winter marches. They were built for cold that could kill a man in minutes. And they were hanging there, unused, while her last chance at a flock froze solid. The idea landed on her not like a whisper but like a command. She would not wait for spring. She would trade what was left of her husband's belongings, his spare boots, the silver belt buckle, the tin daguerreotype of his sister, for a new clutch of Rhode Island Reds, a breed some said were tougher. She would start over but not alone. She would bring Thomas into the coop with her. The coats, she decided, were no longer relics. They were insulation. The day she began cutting apart the first coat, the heavy shears chewing through the thick wool, Neighbors passing by on the road stopped and stared. Ruth Morrow, a sharp-faced woman who considered herself the conscience of the settlement, would later tell anyone who listened that she heard the sound and felt physically sick. Like cutting up a man's soul, she'd say, but Dorothy didn't pause. She tore the lining out of that coat piece by piece and nailed it into the interior walls of the chicken coop, covering every drafty seam, every knothole where the prairie wind found its way through. By the end of the week, the coop had transformed. Inside, the walls were a patchwork of gray and blue wool, thick as a frontier blanket. The floors were packed with straw and dried manure, the traditional methods, but the wool was the real armor. It breathed, holding warmth without trapping moisture. Dorothy moved the old stove pipe, a section of iron that had once vented smoke from the cabin, to pass through the coop, giving the birds a secondary heat source. The structure looked less like a chicken coop now and more like a tiny fortress. And the townspeople, led by Ruth Morrow, were not quiet about what they thought. At the small Methodist church the following Sunday, the Reverend Alden Phillips gave a sermon on honoring the dead that lingered uncomfortably on the sin of desecration. Every eye in the room turned toward Dorothy in the back pew. She sat stone still, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes fixed on the cross. She did not explain herself, but she also did not repent. What the congregation didn't know, what nobody outside that cabin knew, was that Dorothy had begun to notice something strange inside the coop even before the deep cold returned. The hens, 10 of them now, lively and scratching, seemed calmer than any flock she'd ever kept. They spent less energy shivering. Their combs stayed red instead of turning pale. And one morning, around the third week of January, she collected an egg, then another, not frozen, fully formed. She carried them into the cabin and set them on the table in the pale light, her own breath catching in her throat. The coats were working, but the neighbors' whispers were growing louder, and the winter was far from over. The real test had not even begun. Then, on February 3rd, the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind fell silent. The old-timers called it the held breath. That evening, a rider from the stage station brought news that a massive storm was rolling down from the Assiniboine country, a blizzard of the kind that had buried entire wagon trains in '63. Temperatures were predicted to drop to 40 below zero, and they would stay there for days. Dorothy stood on the porch that night, watching the last light vanish behind the ridge, and thought about the wool walls, about Thomas, about the fragile bodies of 10 hens that now carried all her hope. As she closed the cabin door and barred it, she understood with absolute clarity that the next sunrise would answer the only question that mattered. Had she honored her husband's memory by using his coats to build life, or had she simply killed her last chance at survival in the most foolish way imaginable? The blizzard arrived not as gentle snowfall, but as a wall of frozen buckshot that tore through the cottonwoods and hit the homestead like a battering ram. The first gust shook the cabin hard enough to rattle the cast-iron skillet off its hook. Dorothy had spent the last hours of daylight reinforcing the coop door with a timber brace, triple-checking the stovepipe connection that ran from the cabin wall into the wool-lined shed, and moving the water bucket inside where the hens could reach it. As the wind rose to a steady roar and the windows went white, she sat by the stove, listening. The hens were silent. In a world where a stressed bird squawked at the drop of a pin, silence was either a miracle or an omen. By midnight, the temperature had plunged past 30 below and was still falling. Dorothy wrapped herself in a quilt and forced the cabin door open just enough to peer outside. The cold hit her face like a blade. The path to the coop, 10 yards away, had vanished beneath a shifting dune of snow. She could see the dark outline of the wool-lined shed, though, and a faint sliver of orange lamplight leaking from the stovepipe joint. No frost was building on the inside of the coop window. That was the first concrete sign that the coats were doing more than just insulating. They were holding the heat in a way no straw chinking ever had. When the first light of dawn finally bled through the storm, she could wait no longer. Roped to the porch beam, she fought her way through chest-high drifts to the coop door and pulled it open. A wave of warm, animal-scented air washed over her face. All 10 hens were alive, perched on the roost bar, their feathers fluffed but their combs a healthy crimson. and in the nest box, nestled in a bed of chopped straw and wool scraps, sat 2 eggs, not frozen. Perfect. Dorothy lifted one into her palm and felt its warmth. She stood there in the howling chaos, holding proof that a dead man's coat could indeed create life. But the storm was only half the battle. The real war was about to be waged inside the settlement itself. When the blizzard finally broke 3 days later, the surrounding homesteads looked like graves. Snow fences had collapsed. Drifts had climbed over cabin roofs, smothering chimneys. The stage road was impassable, and the mercantile in town had sold out of nearly everything except salt pork and dried beans. But the worst damage, the quiet catastrophe that no one wanted to talk about openly, was happening inside the chicken coops. Almost every family in the county had lost their flock, frozen solid. The morning after the thaw, the air was thick with the sound of axes splitting frozen birds from roosts. Ruth Morrow, whose husband kept a respectable flock of 20 Dominiques, discovered every single one of them dead, their bodies so stiff she had to pry them off the perches with a crowbar. Yet Dorothy Hargrave walked into the mercantile 3 days after the storm carrying a basket of 6 brown eggs as casually as if she were delivering a loaf of bread. The silence that fell over the store was so sudden that the clerk, Amos Carver, dropped his pencil. A woman from the church, Minnie Foster, stared at the eggs as if they were apparitions. "Where did you get those?" she asked, her voice sharper than a scalpel. Dorothy set the basket on the counter and said nothing, but everyone already knew. The story of her desecration, the dead man's coats, had been whispered for weeks. Now they were looking at the result: fresh eggs in the middle of a killing winter. Ruth Morrow did not remain silent for long. That Sunday, she stood up during the prayer meeting and, with tears in her eyes, accused Dorothy of vile and unnatural practices. She claimed the eggs were tainted, that no God-fearing hen could produce life inside a tomb lined with a soldier's burial cloth. Reverend Alden Phillips, a man who preferred comfortable sermons about humility, was now trapped by the fury of his congregation. He did not defend Dorothy. Instead, he announced a special evening session to discuss the moral implications of her actions. The word spread fast. Dorothy Hargrave would be brought before the church, and she would be expected to repent. But here is what the gathering did not anticipate. Dorothy showed up. She walked into that small, kerosene-lit church wearing a clean apron over her faded prairie dress, and she placed a single brown egg on the altar table. The room went deathly quiet. Ruth Morrow stiffened in her pew. The Reverend opened his mouth to speak, but Dorothy spoke first. "My husband marched through the Shenandoah in those coats," she said, her voice steady as winter stone. "He survived rebel fire and frozen mud. He wore them the day he homesteaded our land, the day he built our cabin, and the day he rode out to fix a fence and never came back. I did not cut up his coats because I stopped loving him. I cut them because those hens are the only living thing he left me that I can still feed. And if keeping them alive is a sin, then I will gladly answer for it." The church erupted. Some called her a blasphemer. Others, especially the men who had fought in the war, sat in stunned silence. The Reverend looked at the egg on the altar table and could not find a single verse to condemn it. That night the congregation split in half. Dorothy left the church with a few quiet nods of support but many more glares of hatred. She had not repented. She had, in fact, turned the coats into a weapon of logic. The days that followed were strange and shifting. The eggs kept coming. Dorothy collected 2, sometimes 3 a day, and she began trading them at the stage station for salt, flour, and coffee. The stagecoach drivers, who cared little about church politics and everything about hot breakfasts, spread the word up and down the line. Soon, travelers from as far as Bismarck were asking if there were any fresh eggs to be had at the Hargrave place. She began charging a nickel apiece, then a dime. In a land where a dozen eggs could buy a man's labor for half a day, Dorothy was sitting on a small gold mine. She stored the coins in a glass jar behind the loose hearthstone. Ruth Morrow, meanwhile, could not let the wound heal. She called on Amos Carver, the mercantile owner, and demanded he stop selling Dorothy's eggs. Carver refused. Business was business, and he'd never seen such a steady supply in February. So Ruth took a different route. She began hinting that Dorothy's success was unnatural, that the hens were bewitched, that the wool had somehow corrupted the birds into laying all winter. It was an old and dangerous accusation on the frontier, where superstition often walked hand in hand with scripture, and it was just the right kind of ugliness to find a home in frightened minds. One morning in late February, Dorothy woke to find the coop door swinging open. Inside, the wool lining had been torn from one wall, shredded into pieces. 3 hens were missing. The paw prints in the snow were not from a fox or a coyote. They were the unmistakable tread of a man's boot. Someone had tried to destroy her flock. Dorothy stood in the snow, her breath clouding in the pale light, and felt a cold far sharper than the Dakota wind. This was no longer about eggs or old coats. This was about whether a woman alone could own anything in a land built by men. She did not report the crime to the sheriff, who was 40 miles away and likely already eating at Ruth Morrow's table. Instead, she rebuilt the wall. She tacked in the remaining scraps of wool and added a new layer of canvas, then set a heavy trap of split logs near the door, not to kill but to make noise. She began sleeping with her husband's old service revolver beneath the pillow, and she waited, but the aggressor did not return. Instead, something else happened that no one predicted. The surviving 7 hens, perhaps energized by the warmth or responding to the suddenly richer feed of thawed grain and melted tallow, began laying with an intensity Dorothy had never seen. 4 eggs a day, then 5. By early March, she was collecting more eggs from 7 hens than Ruth Morrow had ever gotten from 20 in the height of summer. The wool, it turned out, had done something else beyond insulation. It had filtered the ammonia from the droppings better than straw, keeping the air cleaner. The hens were healthier, and the eggs, when she cracked one into a skillet, were larger and richer, their yolks the color of sunset. Dorothy looked at her accumulating jar of coins and made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of the county. When the first wagons broke through the spring mud, she traveled to the railhead and spent nearly every cent on 100-day-old Rhode Island red chicks. She also bought a rooster, a mean-looking bird with a black tail and a crimson comb that looked like he'd pick a fight with a bear. The homesteader at the railhead laughed and said she'd gone mad. "You can't manage 100 chicks on your own," he whispered. Dorothy didn't answer. She simply loaded the peeping crates into her wagon and headed home. The word of her purchase reached the settlement before she did. By the time Dorothy's wagon rolled into her yard, a small crowd had gathered. Ruth Morrow stood at the front, arms crossed, her face tight with disbelief. The Reverend waited in the shade of the general store, looking uneasy. Amos Carver watched from his doorway with a calculating expression. Dorothy ignored them all. She spent the next 3 weeks building the largest chicken house the county had ever seen, its walls lined not with a dead man's coats but with a new material she'd discovered, oiled paper and wood shavings, layered like pastry, cheap and effective. She called it the Hargrave Poultry Yard, the first commercial aviary in the territory, and she nailed a sign above the door that was simply her name. The spring of 1883 was a green and generous one, and Dorothy's 100 chicks grew into a flock that numbered nearly 95 after the inevitable losses. By June, they were laying, and Dorothy was shipping eggs by the crate to the mining camps in the Black Hills. She began paying local boys to haul feed and clean coops. She hired a carpenter to build a proper egg cellar. The glass jar beneath the hearthstone became a locked strongbox. She was, by every measure, succeeding beyond anyone's worst fears. And precisely that was the problem. The men of the settlement, the ones who had silently watched her husband's death and expected his land to revert to a male relative or perhaps to themselves, began to realize that Dorothy Hargrave was not going away. Worse, she was outturning them. The same church deacon who had muttered prayers for her soul now started murmuring about the impropriety of a woman doing business outside a husband's protection. The Ranchers' Association, a loose group of cattlemen, grumbled that a poultry empire would attract pests and disease to the grasslands. Amos Carver, who had once bought her eggs for a nickel, realized he was now dependent on her supply and deeply resented it. So they called a meeting. Not a church meeting, but something quieter in the back room of the mercantile. 6 men, all landowners. Their agenda was simple: find a legal or social lever to pull that would strip Dorothy Hargrave of her property and her birds. They did not invite her, but a boy who swept the floor, one of the ones Dorothy paid to haul feed, pressed his ear to the crack in the door and heard them speak her name. He ran through the dark to the Hargrave place and told Dorothy everything. "They say they'll find a way," he warned, his voice shaking. "They say no woman can hold a business alone, not if the county fathers don't approve." Dorothy stood on her porch, the rooster crowing from the distant coop, and looked at the lantern lights burning in the town below. The coats had carried her through winter. The chicks had promised her a future. Now the very men who had buried husbands, broken land, and built a society on the edge of nowhere were preparing to do what the blizzard could not, destroy her entirely, and they would use the law itself to do it. The boy's name was Ephraim, a skinny 12-year-old with a shock of hair the color of dry corn husks. He had run 3 miles in the dark, his lungs burning because Dorothy Hargrave paid him fairly, and because his own mother had died the winter before and no one in town had lifted a finger to help. He delivered his warning standing in the muddy yard, shivering, and Dorothy listened without interrupting. When he finished, she handed him a warm egg from her apron pocket and told him to go home. Then she went inside, lit the lantern, and began to plan. She knew the men in the mercantile's back room. Amos Carver, the storekeeper, who saw her ledger balances and envied every cent. Garrett Cole, a cattleman who had tried to buy her land for a pittance after Thomas died and been refused. And Ruth Morrow's husband, Ellis, a man whose professional failures were matched only by his wife's piety. 3 others, all ranchers, whose names she had heard only in passing. Their weapon would not be honest accusation but legal paper, a tactic borrowed from the railroads and the land sharks. On the frontier, a woman alone could hold a claim only as a widow, and only if she proved continuous improvement. If the county fathers could argue that she had failed to work the land properly, or that her poultry operation was a public nuisance, they could trigger a review. And in a territory where judges rode circuit twice a year and were often friends with the very men who appointed them, a review was indistinguishable from a seizure. Dorothy had not survived the blizzard by waiting. Before dawn, she packed a satchel and rode out to the land office in Fort Sully, a journey of nearly 50 miles through spring mud. The clerk, a tired man named Hurlburt, searched the files and found the original entry for Thomas Hargrave, dated September of 1880. The homestead was valid. But pinned to the back of the document was a letter, recently filed, requesting an investigation into the abandonment and misuse of the claim, signed by 5 men of the Cannonball settlement, including Amos Carver and Ellis Morrow. The clerk's face pinched. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this is serious. If the commissioner finds in their favor, the land reverts to the public domain, and you could be removed." Dorothy felt the cold of the office seep through her coat. But then she asked to see the letter again, and she noticed something no one else had. The letter alleged that the land was not being used for productive agriculture, that the poultry house constituted a speculative enterprise unsanctioned by homestead law. Yet the Homestead Act of 1862 required only that a claimant cultivate crops and make improvements. It said nothing about the type of farming. The men had overreached. Hurlburt admitted this was a gray area, but gray areas were where powerful men prospered and widows drowned. He advised her to hire a lawyer. She had exactly $14.30 in coins. A lawyer would cost more than she could earn in a season. She rode home with her fate suspended. But when she arrived, the situation had already worsened. Garrett Cole had taken it upon himself to string barbed wire across the creek that ran through her property, cutting off the water supply to her lower pasture. He claimed an old grazing easement that predated her claim. Ellis Morrow had filed a complaint with the Territorial Sanitation Board, alleging that the Hargrave poultry yard was breeding vermin that threatened the health of the settlement. The complaint was nonsense. Dorothy's coops were cleaner than any barn in the county, but a sanitation inspector was now obligated to visit. And Ruth Morrow had begun a whispering campaign so effective that women who had once traded sewing patterns with Dorothy now crossed the street when she passed. One Sunday after services, The Reverend did not speak of repentance as before. Instead, he announced that the church would withhold its fellowship from any member who knowingly engaged in unrighteous commerce. The edict was so clearly aimed at Dorothy that two families stood up and walked out. Among them was Minnie Foster, the woman who had first questioned the eggs in the mercantile months before. Something had changed in Minnie. She found Dorothy behind the churchyard, her face flushed with anger. "I've seen Ruth's ledger," Minnie whispered. "Her husband bought up the old Coulter place last spring, but the well is dry. They need your creek to make the cattle pay. This was never about eggs or coats. It was always about water." That was the moment the conspiracy fully unspooled. The Morrow and Cole families, allied with Carver's credit, were orchestrating a land grab. Dorothy's parcel sat at the confluence of three seasonal streams, the only reliable water source for miles in a dry year. Without it, the surrounding ranches could not expand their herds. With it, they could double their cattle operation and dominate the county's beef trade. The poultry yard, the desecration scandal, the midnight Coop raid, they were all pressure points in a campaign designed to exhaust her into selling or to force the land office to rule against her. She was not merely a woman in their way. She was the keystone of an entire economic design. But Dorothy now possessed knowledge they had not counted on. She knew the law, or at least the part of it that mattered. The sanitation complaint, if the inspector could be shown the truth, might backfire spectacularly and reveal the conspiracy. The water rights were not subject to grazing easements because her land had been surveyed before Cole's claim. She spent 3 nights piecing together every scrap of documentation Thomas had left behind. The initial survey, the water rights clause in the homestead filing, even a faded contract showing that the previous owner had never granted easements. Then she wrote letters to the territorial governor, the land commissioner, and the circuit judge. She sent them with the stagecoach drivers, who by now were fiercely loyal to the woman who kept them fed with fresh eggs on frozen mornings. The inspector arrived on a Tuesday in June, a fussy little man from Bismarck with spectacles and a leather valise. He toured the poultry yard expecting filth and found instead a model of efficiency. The oiled paper walls were clean, the droppings composted in a lime pit downwind, the water trough scrubbed daily. The inspector sniffed the air and looked almost disappointed. Then Dorothy guided him to the barbed wire across the creek and explained that Garrett Cole had strung it without permission, forcing her birds to drink from a stagnant pond that could, in fact, breed disease. She suggested, with a voice of pure innocence, that if the board were truly concerned about sanitation, it should investigate the source of that obstruction. The inspector's pen moved rapidly across his notepad. A few days later, Ellis Morrow received a notice that his complaint had been dismissed, and a counter-inquiry was being opened into waterway interference. Then came the court hearing. The circuit judge, a weary man named Thatcher, convened session in the makeshift courtroom above the mercantile. The room was packed. Dorothy stood alone before the bench, no lawyer, but she placed on the table the original homestead entry, the survey, the letters from the governor's office acknowledging receipt of her communication, and the inspector's report exonerating her yard. Amos Carver, representing the complainants, presented their case, that a single woman could not fulfill the improvement clause, that the poultry business was an unseemly deviation from traditional farming, and that the coats were evidence of moral turpitude. Judge Thatcher listened, his expression unreadable. Then Dorothy spoke. She did not raise her voice. She described the winter of '83, the frozen birds, the price of a nickel per egg when children were starving. She held up a document that no one had seen before, a copy of the territorial newspaper from March, in which the stagecoach drivers had posted a public notice of thanks for her reliable supply. She then turned to the complainants and asked quietly whether they had ever fed a hungry traveler without charge. The room shifted. Garrett Cole's jaw tightened. Ellis Morrow looked at the floor. But wait, it got worse. Because at that moment the doors opened and Ephraim walked in carrying a burlap sack. He poured its contents onto the floor. A set of broken boot prints cast in plaster, taken from the snow outside Dorothy's coop the night it was vandalized. Beside them, a ledger from the mercantile showing that Ellis Morrow had purchased the exact same boot taxed 2 days before the incident. The gasps filled the room before Judge Thatcher could slam his gavel. The sabotage, so casually assumed to be the work of a passing stranger, was committed by the very man asking the court to strip Dorothy of her property. Judge Thatcher recessed for an hour. When he returned, his voice was cold. He dismissed the land challenge for lack of merit. He fined Ellis Morrow $50 for trespass and destruction of property. He warned Amos Carver that if another groundless complaint came from his establishment, the court would view it as barratry. And then he issued a ruling that would echo through the territory. A widow who continued improvement and productive use of a homestead held full rights under the law, regardless of the type of farming she pursued. The Hargrave poultry yard was legal, protected, and vindicated. But the real battle was not over. The men, humiliated, retreated to their ranches. Ruth Morrow refused to leave her house for a month. Ellis Morrow paid his fine with money borrowed from Carver, and the debt compounded their bitterness. Garrett Cole removed the barbed wire but began a new tactic, price warfare at the mercantile. He convinced Carver to cut the price of shipped eggs, bringing in crates from Iowa at a loss just to undercut Dorothy's market. Her sales dipped. The strongbox stopped growing. She had won the legal fight, but the economic war was just beginning, and something even larger was looming. The winter of 1884 was predicted by the old-timers to be a brutal one, a mirror of the starvations of the 40s. If Dorothy's expanded flock of 95 birds could not withstand a longer, harder freeze, she would lose the very foundation of her independence. The Coats had saved 10 hens. With the new material, old paper and wood shavings, protect 100 in temperatures that might plunge past 50 below. No one knew. She was about to gamble her entire livelihood on an untested system, while the men she had defeated waited like wolves for the first sign of failure. On the last warm day of October, Dorothy climbed onto the roof of her poultry house and reinforced the seams with pine pitch. She looked north toward the darkening sky and understood that the law could not help her now. Only her own stubbornness, and the secret she still carried, a final piece of Thomas's legacy, would determine whether she came out of this winter as a founder of something new or as a cautionary tale whispered in church basements. That secret was still folded inside the lining of the last coat, a coat she had never cut and never would. And it would change everything. The winter of 1884 did not announce itself with the held breath of the previous year. It arrived as a series of hammer blows, each one colder and more vicious than the last. By the final week of November, the temperature had already plunged to 35 below, and the ponds had frozen so solid that axe blades bounced off them without leaving a scratch. Dorothy's 95 hens were now 120, her flock swollen by a late summer hatch she had not planned but could not refuse. The new poultry house, long as a barn and lined with layered old paper and wood shavings, seemed sturdy enough in theory. But theory had never met a Dakota winter that could freeze a man's lungs inside his chest. The first crisis came on December 10th. A wind shift drove snow directly against the western wall of the poultry house, the one section where the oiled paper had been stretched thinnest. The temperature outside collapsed to 48 below. Inside the coop, the birds began to huddle dangerously, their combs paling at the edges. Dorothy discovered the problem at dawn, when she arrived to find 3 hens dead from suffocation, crushed in the frantic press for warmth. The paper had lost its seal, and a needle of frozen air was slicing through the wall like a knife. She spent the whole day packing the breach with every spare scrap of fabric she owned, old blankets, a worn-out rug, even a bolt of muslin she had been saving for curtains. But the cold kept coming, and she knew that if another wall failed, the entire flock would die. That night, alone in the cabin, Dorothy went to the peg by the door where the last coat still hung. She had not touched it since the day she cut apart the other 2. This coat was the dress uniform blouse, the one Thomas had worn when they married, the one she had sworn never to alter. She lifted it down and held it for a long moment, pressing her face into the wool where his scent had long since faded. Then she turned back the lining and felt something crinkle beneath her fingers. A packet, stitched into the inner breast, so carefully concealed that even she had never noticed it. She opened the stitching with trembling hands and found a folded sheet of heavy paper, oilcloth wrapped to keep it dry. It was a land patent, signed and sealed, for 160 acres adjoining her homestead, the very parcel with the creek headwaters that Garrett Cole claimed he had grazing rights to. Thomas had bought it quiet and unseen just before his death and never told her. Inside the package were also 10 double-eagle gold pieces, $20 in coin, and a single sheet of paper in Thomas's rough handwriting. The letter was brief. Dorothy, if you're reading this, I'm gone. This land is yours, free and clear. So is the water. I knew the cattlemen would try to push you out. I'm giving you a weapon. Don't let them take what we built. I love you, Thomas. She sat there until the lantern burned low, the gold coins heavy in her palm. In one stroke, she now possessed legal title to the water source that the Morrow and Cole families had schemed to steal. She had capital, and she had her husband's final instruction. The coat itself, the relic she had preserved, now became the most important tool in her arsenal, not for its wool, but for the secret it had carried through the grave. By morning, she had a plan. The gold went into a new strongbox. The land patent went into a leather pouch around her neck. She hitched the wagon and made the journey to Fort Sully once more, arriving at the land office just as the clerk Hurlburt was closing. She filed the patent and recorded the deed, making the water rights permanent and unassailable. Hurlburt, who had grown to respect her stubbornness, filed the paperwork without delay and recommended she send a notice to the territorial newspaper, which she did. The announcement would appear in the next edition. Dorothy Hargrave, sole proprietor of the Hargrave Poultry Yard and now the largest private landholder in the Cannonball settlement. The news hit the mercantile like a thunderclap. Amos Carver read the newspaper and felt the floor drop out of his scheme. Without the water, the hostile cattle expansion was impossible. Garrett Cole stormed into his office, face purple, demanding action. But there was none to take. The law was absolute. Ellis Morrow, still paying off his fine, simply slumped against the counter and said nothing. Ruth Morrow, upon hearing that Dorothy now owned the creek her husband had tried to steal, locked herself in her bedroom for 2 days and refused to speak. But the winter was not yet finished. In January, a second blizzard roared down from the Assiniboine, this one even more violent than the first. For 5 days, the world vanished. Dorothy burned wood and fed the stove in the poultry house constantly, rotating the heavy cast-iron baffles she had installed to keep heat circulating. The oiled paper held, barely. Once, she had to tear the sleeve from Thomas's last coat. Now that she had the letter and patent, the wool itself was a tool again, to patch a new leak near the roof. The sacrifice of that sleeve saved the birds. When the storm finally exhausted itself, Dorothy walked into the coop and found every single hen alive. The nest boxes were full. 73 eggs, warm and perfect. The Hargrave method had been tested against the worst winter in living memory, and it had prevailed. Word of the flock's survival spread. The stagecoach drivers, ever loyal, told the story up and down the line. A reporter from the Bismarck Tribune, stranded during the storm, wrote a feature about the widow who defeated winter with her husband's coat. By March, settlers from 3 counties away were writing to ask how to build a Hargrave-style poultry house. Dorothy, ever pragmatic, began selling handwritten instruction sheets for $1 apiece. She sold chicks from her spring hatch. She hired 2 more workers. The egg business expanded beyond the mining camps to the railroad hotels and army forts. The economic war that Carver and Cole had waged collapsed under the sheer weight of her success. The shipped eggs from Iowa could not match the freshness of Dorothy's daily deliveries, and the price war bled Carver's credit dry. He closed his mercantile in the summer of 1885, moving east with what little remained of his fortune. Garrett Cole's ranch, denied the water it needed, shrank to a marginal operation, and was eventually absorbed by a larger outfit from Bismarck. Ellis Morrow and his wife Ruth left the territory, their reputations so thoroughly damaged that even the church declined to bid them farewell. The Reverend Alden Phillips, who had once preached against Dorothy, quietly began purchasing her eggs for the parsonage breakfast. But the twist that no one saw coming was this. In the summer of 1886, Dorothy Hargrave did not merely own the first commercial poultry yard in the county. She owned the only asterisk one that mattered. She had expanded her flock to over 500 birds, supplying eggs to every settlement within 100 miles. She built a hatchery and sold breeding stock, including the Rhode Island Reds that had first proven their toughness. She trained other women, widows mostly, in the Hargrave method, and a small network of independent poultry keepers grew under her guidance. By 1890, the Cannonball Basin was no longer cattle country. It was egg country. The transformation, driven by one woman's refusal to freeze or fold, had rewritten the economic map. Yet the most curious detail remained hidden until years later. In 1902, when Dorothy finally agreed to tell her story to a regional historical society, she revealed that she had never thrown away Thomas's coats, not even the pieces she had cut and nailed into the walls. After the poultry house was remodeled with modern insulation, she had the remaining wool scraps carefully removed, cleaned, and stitched into patchwork quilts for her grandchildren. And the coat that had held the letter, the one with the missing sleeve, she had restored and framed in a glass case, hanging above the door of the original coop. It became a local landmark, a strange and sacred artifact that travelers would detour to see. The Hargrave poultry yard outlasted Dorothy herself. She died in 1927 at the age of 73, a wealthy woman who had never remarried. Her daughter took over the business, and her granddaughter later turned it into a regional cooperative that still operated through the Great Depression. The original wool-lined coop stood until a prairie fire swept the basin in 1941, but by then, the idea it represented had already seeded itself across the entire northern plains. The Hargrave ring, as some called it, was simply the practice of insulating coops with old wool garments. It became so common that few remembered its origin, a widow's desperate gamble with her dead husband's coats. But in the Cannonball Settlement Cemetery, on a low hill overlooking the land Thomas had secretly bought with his soldiers' pay, a headstone reads, Dorothy Hargrave, 1854-1927. She taught the winter where to break. And carved beneath, a single image, an egg whole and unbroken beside a folded coat. The story of Dorothy Hargrave did not end at her grave. It had already escaped into the world long before, carried by stagecoach drivers, imitated by settlers, and written into the unwritten manual of prairie survival. What began as a widow's desperate act became a method so common that people forgot it ever had a beginning. But forgotten origins have a way of hiding the sharpest truths. Dorothy never filed a patent, never gave the method a name, and never charged for the idea itself, only for the eggs. That quiet generosity seeded an entire industry. By the time the Hargrave ring was standard practice across the northern plains, thousands of families were eating fresh eggs through winters that once would have starved them. Yet the question lingers, as it does for every act of defiance disguised as madness. Was Dorothy Hargrave truly a visionary, or was she simply a woman who refused to let grief and cold freeze her into inaction? The neighbor who called her a desecrator would have let those coats rot on the peg, honoring memory with stillness. Dorothy honored memory with motion. She understood, perhaps earlier than most, that survival on the frontier was not about preserving the past in glass cases. It was about letting the past work for the living. Thomas saved her life not by being enshrined, but by being used. And that single, startling inversion, turning a burial shroud into a cradle, broke a pattern that had held the basin in poverty for decades. So the next time you encounter a story of someone choosing the practical over the sentimental and being condemned for it, ask yourself which kind of person you would have been in that mercantile crowd. The one who whispered shame, or the one who loaded a crate of eggs onto a stagecoach headed west. Because the line between desecration and creation is sometimes as thin as the wool of an old army coat, and winter has never cared which side of it we stand on. Subscribe now to witness more untold stories of frontier defiance, forgotten inventors, and the people who taught nature itself to bend.